It is no longer news that in 2016 millions of Britons voted for Britain to leave the European Union. What followed that decision was a political shift and an identity crisis that shattered years of diplomatic ties, divided families, and sent financial crises throughout the global markets. The morning after, the pound recorded its lowest low in the last 30 years, with world leaders scrambling to make sense of Britain's new stance. Was Brexit really about trade and laws, or was it about something deeply rooted in how desperate UK citizens wanted to be free from the rest of Europe?
Is that everybody has to speak English.
Britain's identity has never been simple to define, unlike France, Germany, or Italy. This is because the United Kingdom is a union of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, 4 regions with different histories, cultures, and political standing. Yet for centuries, Britain saw itself as a dominant global power, an empire that once ruled over a quarter of the world's population. This imperial legacy shaped how Britain saw their place long after the empire had faded. For this reason, Brexit was not just a vote on whether to remain in the EU, it became a struggle over what it meant to be British in the modern world. Before the referendum, the UK had already been wrestling with the crucial questions about its national identity. The country witnessed a surge in immigrants in the early 2000s, particularly after the 2004 EU expansion, which allowed millions of workers from other EU countries such as Poland, Hungary, and Romania to move to Britain under the free movement rules. For some, this was a sign of progress and proof that Britain was an open, multicultural society. It was a warning sign for others that British culture and jobs would now be threatened. Statistics from the referendum tell quite a straightforward story. Older voters, particularly those 50 years and above, overwhelmingly supported the move to leave, while much younger voters, especially those under 30, wanted the UK to remain with the Union. The divide was also deeply geographical, as London, Scotland, and Northern Ireland voted strongly to stay, while many parts of rural England and post-industrial towns voted to leave. Why did this happen? Part of the answer lies in education and class, as studies revealed that voters with university degrees were far more likely to support staying. Many voters who wanted to opt out of the EU lived in areas that had suffered significant economic decline, particularly in former manufacturing hubs in northern England, where the wave of globalization and modern automation had neglected local industries. To them, the EU represented a remote bureaucratic institution that had done little to improve their everyday lives. However, was leaving the EU truly about the economy, or was it a desire to reclaim a sense of a lost national pride? The British identity, for many, is tied to the idea and belief that Britain should govern itself and be free from external influence. This view was maintained at the heart of the Brexit debate in 2016. Some members of the UK Parliament often portrayed the EU as an overreaching body that dictated most of the UK's policies, from its immigration rules to trade regulations. Many saw Brussels as an unelected force controlling much of British law, even though the UK had a strong voice in EU policy making and had secured several exits over the years. Many voters chose Brexit not just for political reasons, but also to reclaim an identity they felt was lost due to globalization, immigration, and distrust of the European Union. However, the idea of a single British identity was already being debated before Brexit. Scotland, which voted to remain in the EU by over 61%, had been questioning its place in the United Kingdom since its 2014 independence referendum. Many Scots citizens saw Brexit as an English-driven decision that ignored their will. On the other hand, Northern Ireland, which voted to remain in the EU by about 56%, faced a different crisis. If Brexit were actualised, it would raise the motion for a hard border with Ireland, threatening the fragile peace established by the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. Similarly, in Wales, where 52.5% voted to leave, opinions were mixed, as some citizens saw Brexit as an opportunity to become competitive and economic revival to other EU countries. In contrast, others feared losing EU funding that had been very helpful in infrastructural projects across the country. With these deep divides in age, class, education and geography, Was Brexit really about sovereignty? Or was it a referendum on what it means to be British in the 21st century? Let's look at how the push for independence was used to get something unexpected.
This deal delivers the biggest restoration of sovereignty in our parliamentary history and the biggest devolution of power to UK democratic institutions.
Of all the arguments used in the Brexit campaign by all prime ministers who spearheaded the notion, none was as powerful as remembering the people of the sovereignty Brexit will give to the UK. The Leave campaign slogan, "Take Back Control," was short, sharp and effective in conveying the message of sovereignty. The Brexit proposal was based on the belief that Britain had lost control to Brussels, which was making important decisions instead of Westminster. Was this claim valid? The idea that the UK had surrendered its sovereignty to the EU had been pushed for decades by Eurosceptic politicians and media outlets, such as the Daily Mail and The Sun. Figures like Nigel Farage, leader of the UK Independence Party, made EU membership seem like one that dictated Britain's immigration policies, trade agreements and legal system. However, the reality was relatively more complex. The UK had one of the strongest positions within the EU, with opt-outs from key policies like the Eurozone and the Schengen area. It also had a powerful voice in shaping most of the Union's legislation and was often referred to as one of the big three, alongside Germany and France. However, this difference in the UK's position was frequently lost in public debate. Sovereignty for the UK was a double-edged sword, and while those who campaigned to leave argued that Brexit would restore complete parliamentary control, they did not clarify what this would mean in practice. The European Union gave Britain easy, tariff-free trade with its member countries. However, after leaving the EU, Britain now has to negotiate new trade deals, often from a weaker position. The Northern Ireland Protocol, an attempt to prevent a physical border with Ireland, kept Northern Ireland under some EU trade rules, leading to fresh tensions. This begs the question, has the push for Brexit restored sovereignty to the UK, or did it create a new form of dependency and economic headaches? Yet those who battled for and wanted the UK to be in the EU did not find it simple to counter the sovereignty arguments. While they highlighted the economic risks of Brexit, they could not set out an emotionally compelling vision of EU membership. Their messages were called Project Fear, focusing on worst-case scenarios. The Leave campaign's message to take back control resonated with those disillusioned with the political establishment. Sovereignty, as a concept, is deeply personal. It's about who makes the rules, who holds the power, and who gets to decide the future. However, had the Brexit campaign used it as a rallying cry without a clear plan for what came next? As the dust settled after the vote, many Britons began asking a crucial question. Now that we've taken control, what do we do with it?
The local MP says people in Romford are rallying to the cause to take Britain out of the EU.
For centuries, the question of what Britain stood for politically was complicated, but Brexit turned it into a battlefield. Theoretically, the United Kingdom is one and a collection of nations united under one state. However, no basic distinction existed in how these regions see themselves. At its essence, it was not just about politics or economics. This was now more and more about identity. What is the British nation, and what does it mean to be British anymore? A 2019 study by the National Centre for Social Research found that people who identified as English, not British, were far more likely to have voted for Brexit. In contrast, those who saw themselves as British tended to vote on staying in the EU. This division wasn't accidental. For many years, English nationalism had been growing, fueled by frustrations over immigration, political representation, and a belief that England was being sidelined within its union. England doesn't have a parliament unlike Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland. The Scottish Parliament, the Senate for Welsh Parliament and the Northern Ireland Assembly all control aspects of governance for their regions. However, despite being the largest and most populous part of the UK, England does not have a separate English government. Many English voters felt this was unfair, and believed that decisions affecting England were often influenced by Scottish, Welsh, or Northern Irish politicians. The frustration only grew further when the EU became part of the conversation. The idea that Brussels was making laws that affected England and the belief that Scottish and Welsh leaders had a stronger political voice pushed many English men and women towards Brexit. To them, voting to leave was not just about the EU, but also about asserting English control over its future. The campaign to leave the EU understood this nationalist sentiment and used it effectively at every opportunity. Nigel Farage, leader of the Reform UK party and one of the most vocal figures in this movement, frequently spoke about English identity. He framed Brexit as an opportunity to restore England's pride, often invoking imagery from World War II to suggest that the country had once stood alone against Europe and could do so again. While English nationalism increased, Scottish and Northern Irish nationalism took a different path. Scotland, in particular, considered Brexit a decision that England forced upon them. During the 2016 referendum, 62% of Scottish voters supported remaining in the EU, yet they were still pulled out. This reignited the argument for Scottish independence, and then First Minister Nicola Sturgeon demanded a second referendum to remove Scotland from the UK instantly. In 2014, Scotland had narrowly voted to stay in the UK, but at the time, one of the biggest arguments against independence was that leaving the UK meant leaving the EU. After Brexit was done, that argument collapsed. The situation in Northern Ireland was complex. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 ended long-standing conflicts by relying on an open border with the Republic of Ireland. This agreement was only possible because the UK and Ireland were in the EU, but Brexit changed that too. Suddenly, the question of what would happen to the Irish border became one of the most controversial issues in the entire Brexit process. Irish nationalists who largely voted to remain saw Brexit as a threat to their identity and way of life. Many feared a return to the hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland because it had been a source of violent conflict in the past. On the other hand, unionists who strongly identify as British were more supportive of Brexit, seeing it as a chance to further distance Northern Ireland from the EU and strengthen ties with the UK. This divide created more tensions and raised the discussion of Irish reunification. The Brexit referendum exposed and widened these divisions. This was not just about policy, but about the British people and who they wanted to be in the world. How has Britain controlled the narrative and situation so far? Has the UK truly gained sovereignty, or has it been a matter of self-isolation?
It's now been 2 years since Britain completed its withdrawal from the European Union, and it's still struggling with the fallout.
When Britain left the EU on January 31st, 2020, many expected a prosperous new era. Instead, there has been political instability, economic turbulence, and uncertainty. A major test of Brexit's success is its impact on international trade. As a member of the EU, Britain had access to the biggest single market and customs union, which allowed goods to flow freely between EU member states without tariffs or border checks. Leaving meant losing this automatic access, and new trade agreements had to be negotiated from scratch. In December 2020, the UK struck a last-minute trade and cooperation agreement with the EU, preventing a no-deal Brexit that would have been disastrous for businesses. Even with the deal, companies soon started facing delays, red tape, and higher costs. British exports to the EU fell significantly in the following year, with businesses struggling to adjust to the new customs procedures. The fishing industry, one of the most vocal supporters of Brexit, was hit particularly hard, as British fish exports faced many delays and restrictions when entering the EU. Beyond trade, the UK had relied on migrant workers from the EU to fill jobs in agriculture, hospitality, and healthcare for many years. With the new immigration restrictions, shortages in human labour began to slow down productivity and affect industries that had previously depended on EU workers. By 2021, businesses struggled to find enough workers, from farm labourers to truck drivers, to fill essential roles. Another significant fallout from Brexit was the weakening of Britain's influence on the global scale. The UK had been one of the most influential members inside the EU, helping the Union shape security, trade and climate change policy. Now Britain had to renegotiate its place in world politics outside of this. The UK went on to sign trade deals with countries like Australia, Japan and New Zealand, but none came close to matching the economic benefits of the EU single market. The anticipated UK-US trade deal never materialised under Donald Trump's first term in office, and relations with European leaders remained strained. The political impact of Brexit was equally disruptive as the 2019 prorogation of Parliament by former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, which aimed to prevent MPs from blocking his Brexit plans, was ruled unlawful by the Supreme Court. For many Britons, sovereignty had been the driving force behind Brexit, but to be genuinely free comes at a cost. Was the complete control over laws and borders worth the economic downturn, labour shortages and political fractures? Let's look at the perception of sovereignty for other European countries in recent times.
But colleagues, what does sovereignty in fact mean today in a world that is completely dominated by powerhouses like China?
The question of sovereignty has never been simple to answer across Europe. While Britain saw its exit from the EU as a reclamation of control, other nations within the bloc have viewed its membership in a completely different light. Across the continent, sovereignty has been interpreted in two sharply contrasting ways. For some, the EU represents a loss of national power, while for others, it strengthens their global influence. Nowhere is this divide more evident than between Western and Eastern Europe. In countries like France, Germany and the Netherlands, the EU is primarily seen as a means to amplify their voice on the world stage. Under President Emmanuel Macron, France has championed the idea of a sovereign Europe, arguing that the EU should act as a united geopolitical force capable of standing up to global superpowers like the United States, Russia and China. Macron has always advocated a more integrated European defence, which he believes sovereignty is no longer in national solitude but in collective strength. Germany, still the largest economy in the EU, also shares the same vision and realises that the economic and political stability provided by membership in the EU far exceeds any concerns about losing national control. However, such sovereignty carries a very different meaning in countries like Poland and Hungary. Both nations have had a mixed relationship with the EU, often resisting Brussels' authority regarding judicial autonomy, immigration policy and governance standards. The Poland and Hungary governments, namely Andrzej Sebastian Duda and Viktor Orbán, respectively, have been reported to accuse the EU of being a tyrannical organisation that will erode their national tradition and sovereignty. This tug-of-war has led to frequent clashes with both countries, challenging numerous EU judgments in court and, in some cases, simply refusing to enforce EU law. Eastern European scepticism toward Brussels can be said to be deeply rooted in history. Many Eastern European nations spent decades under the control of the Soviet Union, where Moscow dictated their governments. This leaves a deep distrust of any form of external governance to a large extent. When these countries joined the EU in the early 2000s, they saw membership as a way to align with the West, gain some economic benefits, and escape Russian influence. However, the idea of Brussels making decisions for them became familiar over time. For countries like Poland and Hungary, sovereignty means rejecting anything that resembles foreign rule, even if that rule comes in the form of EU regulations. In contrast, nations like Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania have embraced the EU as a shield against Russian aggression. For them, sovereignty is not about standing alone, but being part of a larger and more powerful alliance. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 reinforced this belief, as the European Union and NATO became their primary security guarantee. These countries see European integration as a survival strategy, ensuring they are not vulnerable to future threats. Southern European nations, such as Italy, Spain, Portugal and Greece, have a more calm view of sovereignty. While they acknowledge the economic struggles of being in the EU, particularly the strict financial rules imposed by the headquarters in Brussels, they recognise that leaving the Union could lead to a potential economic disaster. These countries were probably the most hit by the 2008 to 2012 financial crises, with Greece nearly collapsing under the weight of austerity measures imposed by the EU. Yet despite these frustrations, there has never been a serious push for a Grexit or a Italexit because of the risks of economic isolation outweighing the appeal of complete independence. Even in nations where Euroscepticism exists, few have followed Britain's path. Jordan Bardella's National Rally in France, Matteo Salvini's League in Italy, and other right-wing nationalist movements across Europe have spoken against EU influence, yet none have actively pushed for an exit from the Union. The reason? Brexit's fallout served as a warning as many Europeans watch Britain struggle with its post-Brexit trade deals, political instability and economic downturn. What was once a Eurosceptic dream now looks like a shadow of its glory days. More than 8 years after the Brexit vote, Britain still grapples with the consequences of its decision. In 2025, the country remains independent from the EU, but has it truly regained sovereignty and formed its own identity? Or has it traded one form of dependence for another? One of the biggest promises of Brexit was that the UK could negotiate its trade deals free from EU restrictions. While agreements have been signed with countries like Australia, Japan and New Zealand, the economic benefits have been underwhelming compared to what was lost. British businesses have continued to face new hurdles. The trade regulations in the post-Brexit era, particularly the Northern Ireland Protocol, have been bureaucratic headaches for regional exporters. Several small firms that previously enjoyed free trade with the EU relocated or ceased trading because of the increased cost. Limited access to European markets has impacted various sectors throughout the UK, compelling them to offload discounted products or seek other customers. Public opinion has also changed. A YouGov survey in 2024 found that most Brits now think that Brexit was an error from the beginning. The zeal that drove the Brexit referendum has been substituted with dissatisfaction and regret, as the economic downturn and political chaos have caused many to question their national identity. Despite this change of heart, the mechanism for rejoining the EU remains uncertain. For Britain to return, it would need the unanimous agreement of all 27 EU member countries, many of whom are unhappy with how Britain handled its departure. The EU has moved on, pushing integration and strengthening the Eurozone. If Britain were to reapply, it would no longer enjoy the special privileges it once had, such as no opt-outs from the euro, no rebate on its financial contributions, and no veto power on key policies. As of 2025, the UK's identity as a European world power remains at a crossroads. Some argue that true sovereignty has been achieved because Britain is no longer tied to the European bureaucracy and can shape its future. Others believe that the cost of Brexit has been too high and that sovereignty means little if it comes at the expense of economic stability and global influence. The question remains, was Brexit the dawn of a new global identity for Britain, or the beginning of a long and painful road back to Europe? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you found this insightful, like and subscribe to this channel for more in-depth information about global power shifts. You can also watch the other videos on your screen.